Dr. Naomi Ellis walked through the airport terminal with the kind of quiet confidence that came not from arrogance, but from years of showing up, early, prepared, and steady. Her black leather tote bag held a well-worn stethoscope, a half-empty water bottle, and a paperback novel she'd been trying to finish for weeks. She wore dark slacks, a soft gray sweater, and flats that had seen better days. But everything about her said, "I've earned this moment of rest." It had been a long stretch at the hospital. 3 back-to-back night shifts, 2 emergency surgeries, and a hallway conversation with a grieving family that still sat heavy in her chest. She wasn't running from anything, just toward a few days of quiet in her sister's guest room on the West Coast, where the ocean air smelled like salt and peace. She checked her boarding pass again as she neared gate B12, first class, not because she'd splurged, she rarely did, but because the airline's loyalty program had quietly upgraded her as a thank you for flying with them so often over the years. She didn't think much of it. To her, it was just a wider seat, a little more legroom, maybe a warm towel. Nothing extravagant. Just a small kindness after months of giving everything to others. The gate agent smiled as she scanned her ticket. "Enjoy your flight, Dr. Ellis," she said, glancing at the name on the screen. Naomi nodded, surprised but not flattered. She'd forgotten she'd used her full professional title when booking. She walked down the jet bridge, the hum of the aircraft growing louder with each step. Inside, the cabin was calm. Soft lighting, the faint scent of coffee and cleaning wipes, the gentle murmur of passengers settling in. She found her seat 1A window side right up front. She stowed her bag, smoothed her sweater, and sank into the plush cushion with a quiet sigh. For the first time in days, her shoulders relaxed. A few minutes later, a man in a crisp uniform approached. Late 30s, polite smile, name tag that read Trevor. He leaned in slightly, voice low. "Ma'am, I hate to bother you, but we've got a bit of a situation." Naomi looked up. "Oh? There's a passenger in economy well, he's a frequent flyer and he's used to sitting up here. We'd really appreciate it if you'd be willing to switch seats with him. Just a small favor," she blinked. "Switch seats? But I'm already in first class." "Yes, ma'am, and we truly appreciate your understanding. He's a very important guest for the airline." Naomi didn't move. She'd heard phrases like "very important guest" before. Usually they meant someone with money, connections, or both. But she also knew how these requests often played out. Quietly, politely, and almost always directed at people who looked like her. "I don't think I will," she said gently but firmly. "I earned this seat through my travel history. I'm not asking for anything extra. I just want to sit where I was assigned." Trevor's smile tightened at the edges. "Of course, ma'am. I understand. But it really would help us out. It's just one seat." "It's not just a seat," she replied, meeting his eyes. "It's about respect." He hesitated, then nodded and walked away. She watched him go, her calm returning, though a thread of tension now ran beneath it. 10 minutes later, he was back, with another crew member, older, with sharp eyes and a clipboard. This one didn't smile. "Ma'am," she began, voice clipped, "we've asked you once. We're asking again. The airline would consider it a courtesy if you'd move to row 18. Naomi stayed seated. "And if I don't?" The woman's expression hardened. "Then we may have to ask you to deplane. We can't have passengers refusing reasonable request." "Reasonable?" Naomi repeated, keeping her voice even. "You're asking me to give up a seat I was assigned because someone else prefers it? That doesn't sound reasonable. It sounds like you're treating me like I'm less entitled to be here." A few nearby passengers glanced over. An older woman in 2B shifted uncomfortably. A man across the aisle pretended to read his magazine but kept peeking over the top. The crew member leaned in, lowering her voice. "Look, this isn't personal, but if you make this difficult, it's going to be a problem for everyone." Naomi reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and opened the voice recorder. She didn't say anything, just placed it on her tray table, screen facing up. The crew member noticed immediately. "Are you recording us?" "Yes," Naomi said calmly. "For my own protection. I've done nothing wrong. I'm simply sitting in the seat I was given. If you try to remove me without cause, I'll have evidence." The woman straightened, jaw tight. "Fine, stay, but don't expect any special treatment." "I don't want special treatment," Naomi said. "Just equal treatment." The crew walked away, whispering to each other near the galley. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, heart steady but mind racing. She wasn't angry, just disappointed. She'd flown dozens of times, always professional, always courteous. Yet here she was, being treated like a problem for refusing to shrink herself. As the cabin doors closed and the engines roared to life, she looked out the window at the tarmac lights blurring into streaks. She thought about her patients, the ones who trusted her with their lives, the ones who called her doctor with gratitude in their voices. She thought about her mother, who'd worked 2 jobs so Naomi could go to college, who'd told her, "You'll have to be twice as good just to be seen as equal." She hadn't wanted a scene. She just wanted to fly home in peace. But sometimes peace required standing your ground. The plane lifted off the runway, climbing into the night sky. Around her, passengers adjusted their seats, sipped water, flipped through magazines. Life went on as if nothing had happened. But Naomi knew better. Something had shifted, not just in that cabin, but in her. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a witness. And if no one else would speak up, maybe she'd have to. She didn't reach for her phone to post anything online. Didn't draft a fiery statement. She simply tucked the recorder back into her bag, buckled her seatbelt tighter, and watched the clouds drift below. She'd made her choice. Now she'd live with it, and whatever came next. The flight attendant came by with drinks. She avoided Naomi's row entirely. Naomi didn't mind. She didn't need a drink. She just needed to know she'd done the right thing. And for the first time in a long while, she felt completely sure of that. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane leveled off, the hum of the engine settling into a steady rhythm. Most passengers leaned back, eyes closing or screens flickering to life. But Naomi couldn't relax. The tension from earlier still hung in the air like static, quiet, invisible, but unmistakable. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her breathing slow and deliberate, the way she'd learned during medical school to stay calm in high-pressure moments. She wasn't looking for trouble. She never had been. But she also knew that sometimes trouble found you, especially when you refused to move out of the way. A few rows behind, she could hear the low murmur of conversation. Glancing back discreetly, she saw the man they'd wanted her to give her seat to, a white businessman in his 50s, wearing a tailored suit and an expression of mild irritation. He was speaking sharply to a flight attendant, gesturing toward the front of the plane. The attendant nodded quickly, eyes darting toward Naomi before looking away. Naomi turned back to the window. Outside, the sky was endless black, dotted with stars that seemed impossibly far away. She thought about how small she was in all of this, the plane, the sky, the world. And yet in this moment she felt enormous, like every choice she made mattered more than it ever had before. Minutes passed. Then, without warning, the lead flight attendant, the one with the clipboard, reappeared at the edge of the first-class curtain. This time she wasn't alone. A man in a slightly more formal uniform stood beside her, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Ma'am," the woman said, voice lower now but still edged with authority. "This is Captain Reynolds. He'd like to speak with you." Naomi sat up straighter. "Of course." The captain stepped forward. He was older, with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes that suggested he'd seen more than his share of in-flight drama. But there was no warmth in his gaze, just assessment. "I've been told there's been a disturbance," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "Is that accurate?" "No disturbance, sir," Naomi replied evenly. "Just a request I chose not to honor." "A request that's causing operational complications," the flight attendant cut in. The captain held up a hand, silencing her. He looked at Naomi. "Can you tell me in your own words what happened?" She did. Calmly. Clearly. She explained how she'd been asked to give up her assigned seat for someone in economy, how she'd declined, and how the tone had shifted when she refused. She didn't raise her voice, didn't accuse, just stated facts as if she were giving a patient history during rounds. When she finished, the captain was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You understand that we have discretion when it comes to seating, especially for VIP passengers." "I do," Naomi said. "But discretion shouldn't mean discrimination. I've flown this airline for over a decade. I've never once caused an issue. And today I'm being treated like I'm the problem just because I said no." The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. The captain's jaw tightened. "Look," he said finally, "we're not trying to single you out. But this guest is a major client. His company books hundreds of flights a year with us. If he's unhappy, it affects the whole operation." So my comfort and my dignity don't matter as much as his? Naomi asked, not with anger, but with genuine curiosity. That's not what I'm saying. But it's what you're doing. The silence that followed was thick. A baby cried softly in the back. Someone coughed. The plane dipped slightly, adjusting course. Then, from 2 rows behind, a voice cut through the quiet. "Excuse me," all 3 turned. An older man, gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a rumpled blazer, stood in the aisle. He held a folded newspaper in one hand and a boarding pass in the other. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said, voice calm but firm. "I've been flying commercially since before some of you were born, and I've never seen a passenger treated this way for simply holding their ground." The flight attendant stiffened. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." "It does when it's about basic fairness," he replied. "My name is Robert Hayes. I'm a retired attorney. And if this situation escalates, I'd be happy to serve as a witness." Naomi felt a flicker of relief, not because she needed saving, but because she wasn't alone anymore. The captain's expression darkened. "We appreciate your concern, sir, but we ask that you return to your seat." Robert didn't move. "I will, but I'll also be filing a formal complaint when we land. And I suggest this young woman do the same." He gave Naomi a small nod before turning back. The curtain swished shut behind him. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the captain exhaled sharply. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one last time. Will you move to economy?" "No," Naomi said. "Then we may have no choice but to consider you disruptive." "Disruptive for sitting in my assigned seat?" She almost laughed. "That's not disruption. That's existing." The captain's eyes narrowed. "Fine, stay, but don't expect service. And if you cause any further issues, we will divert the flight." With that, he turned and walked back toward the cockpit. The flight attendant followed, casting one last look over her shoulder, part frustration, part warning. Naomi leaned back again, heart pounding but face calm. She knew what they were doing, trying to isolate her, shame her into compliance. But she'd spent years in hospital rooms where lives hung in the balance. This wasn't life or death, but it was about principle. And principles weren't things you traded for comfort. As the cabin settled back into its routine, something shifted. Passengers who'd avoided eye contact earlier now glanced her way. Not with judgment, but with quiet respect. The woman in 2B offered a small, sympathetic smile. A young man across the aisle gave her a subtle thumbs up when the crew wasn't looking. She didn't respond outwardly. But inside, she felt a quiet swell of solidarity. An hour into the flight, the drink cart came around. It rolled past her row without stopping. No water, no juice, not even a glance. She didn't ask. She just opened her tote bag, pulled out her own water bottle, and took a slow sip. Later, when the meal service began, the same thing happened. First-class passengers received warm towels, cloth napkins, and plated meals. When the cart reached her row, the attendant paused, then deliberately skipped her. Naomi didn't flinch. She'd eaten a protein bar before boarding. She wasn't hungry, but the message was clear. You're not welcome here. Still, she stayed. Not out of stubbornness, but because leaving would mean they'd won. And she refused to let them define her worth based on someone else's preference. Midway through the flight, she excused herself to the lavatory. The tiny space felt like a sanctuary, just her, the hum of the air system, and a moment of privacy. She washed her hands, looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were tired but steady. That's when she remembered the business card. Tucked in the side pocket of her wallet, slightly crumpled from months of travel, was a simple white card with navy lettering. She'd almost forgotten about it. It belonged to a man she'd treated 2 years ago in the ER, a sudden cardiac episode during a layover. He'd been scared, disoriented, clutching his chest in the waiting area. She'd stabilized him, stayed with him until his wife arrived, and even called his cardiologist to coordinate follow-up care. Before he left, he'd pressed the card into her hand. "If you ever need anything, anything at all, call me directly," he'd said. "No gatekeepers. Just me." She'd thanked him politely but never thought she'd use it. Now, standing in that narrow airplane bathroom, she realized this might be the moment. She didn't want revenge, didn't want headlines. She just wanted someone in power to see what had happened, and to ensure it didn't happen to someone else. Back in her seat, she waited until the cabin lights dimmed further, and most passengers were asleep. Then quietly she dialed the number. It rang twice before a groggy but alert voice answered. "Hello? Mr. Langston?" she said softly. "This is Dr. Ellis. We met at Metro General 2 years ago. I'm so sorry to call so late. Dr. Ellis?" His voice sharpened with recognition. "Are you all right? I'm on a flight right now, and something happened that I think you should know about." She told him everything. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just the facts, the request, the pressure, the threat of removal, the silent punishment. She mentioned the recording, the witness, the pattern she suspected but couldn't prove. There was a long pause on the other end. "Then, what airline is this?" She told him. Another pause. Then quietly, "I'm the head of customer experience for that airline." Naomi froze. She hadn't known. She just remembered the kindness, the gratitude in his eyes that night. "I'm so sorry you went through this," he said, voice thick with regret. "Stay on the line. I'm calling our operations center right now." She ended the call with a quiet thank you and slipped the phone back into her bag. Outside, the sky began to lighten at the edges, dawn approaching. The plane would land in less than an hour. She didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time since boarding, she felt a flicker of hope. Not because she expected punishment, but because someone in power had listened. And sometimes that was enough to start a change. As the flight attendants began their final cabin check, they avoided her row completely. But this time Naomi didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, and that made all the difference. The plane began its slow descent just as the first golden streaks of dawn broke over the horizon. Outside the window, clouds glowed pink and orange, soft and quiet, as if the world below had no idea what had just unfolded 30,000 feet above it. Inside the cabin, most passengers were still asleep, wrapped in thin blankets, heads tilted against headrests. But Naomi was wide awake, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her breathing steady, her mind clear. She hadn't slept. Not because she was anxious, though part of her was, but because she kept replaying the phone call in her head. The way the man on the other end had gone from groggy to instantly alert, the quiet anger in his voice when she described what happened, the promise he'd made. This ends today. She didn't know if he could really fix anything, but she trusted him, not because of his title, but because she remembered the way he'd looked at her in the hospital hallway 2 years ago. With gratitude, yes, but also with humility. He hadn't treated her like staff. He'd treated her like a person who'd changed his life. Now she'd asked him to do the same for others. As the plane dipped lower, the seatbelt sign chimed on. A flight attendant walked down the aisle, her steps brisk, her expression unreadable. She didn't glance at Naomi. None of them had since the call. It was as if she'd become a ghost, present but ignored, visible but erased. Naomi didn't mind. She'd spent enough time in hospital rooms where people looked right through her, until they needed her. She knew the difference between being unseen and being unimportant, and she was far from unimportant. When the wheels touched down with a gentle thud, a ripple of relief moved through the cabin. People stretched, gathered their things, checked their phones. The usual post-flight shuffle began, but something felt different this time. There was a tension in the air, subtle but real, like everyone could sense that the story wasn't over yet. As passengers filed into the jet bridge, Naomi stayed seated. She wasn't in a rush. She watched as the man who'd been offered her seat walked past, briefcase in hand, eyes forward, never once looking back. She watched the flight attendants gather near the front, speaking in low, urgent tones. One of them kept glancing toward the gate. Then she saw them. 2 people in dark suits stood just outside the aircraft door, calm, professional, holding tablets. They weren't security. They weren't ground crew. They wore badges with the airline's logo and the words, Customer Relations, Corporate. Naomi's stomach tightened, but she didn't panic. She stood, slung her tote over her shoulder, and walked down the aisle at her own pace. As she stepped off the plane, one of the suited individuals stepped forward. "Dr. Ellis," the woman asked gently. Naomi nodded. "We've been asked to escort you to a private area. Mr. Langston would like to speak with you personally. And there are a few procedural matters we need to address." "Procedural matters?" Naomi asked. "Regarding the crew," the man added. "An internal review has already begun." She didn't say anything, just followed them through a side corridor, away from the main terminal flow. They led her to a quiet lounge near the tarmac, a space usually reserved for pilots or airline executives. Soft chairs, bottled water, no windows. It felt more like a waiting room than a luxury space. Within minutes, Mr. Langston walked in. He looked exhausted, tie slightly loose, eyes shadowed, but his posture was firm, his handshake warm. "Thank you for calling me," he said, sitting across from her. "And thank you for your patience." "I didn't call for myself," Naomi said simply. "I called because this shouldn't keep happening." He nodded. "I know, and I'm ashamed it did, especially to you." He explained that after their call he'd contacted the airline's chief operations officer, legal team, and head of human resources. Within 20 minutes, they'd pulled the flight manifest, reviewed internal communications, and accessed the aircraft's cabin audio logs, standard procedure for any reported incident. Then they'd cross-referenced past complaints. What they found wasn't isolated. Over the past 18 months, there had been 7 similar reports, all involving passengers of color being asked to give up premium seats for white travelers described as VIPs, or high-value clients. In every case, the request was framed as a courtesy, but the tone, the pressure, and the consequences for refusal followed the same pattern. "This wasn't just poor judgment," Mr. Langston said, voice low. "It was systemic, and we missed it because no one ever pushed back hard enough for us to notice." Naomi listened quietly. She didn't feel vindicated, just sad. Sad that it took someone like her, with a title and a voice and a connection, to finally crack the surface. "What happens now?" she asked. "The entire cabin crew from your flight has been placed on immediate administrative leave," he said. "We're launching a full investigation. If the evidence supports what you've said, and from what I've seen so far it does, they'll be terminated. Not just for last night, but for violating our code of conduct repeatedly." Naomi didn't celebrate. She just nodded. "I hope it leads to real change. Not just punishment, it will," he promised. "We're already drafting new protocols. No more courtesy swaps without documented operational need. Mandatory bias training starting next week. And we're creating a direct reporting line for passengers who feel they've been treated unfairly. No gatekeepers, just a real person who listens." She appreciated the plan. But she also knew policies only worked if people believed in them. As they spoke, a quiet knock came at the door. One of the corporate staff stepped in and handed Mr. Langston a tablet. He scanned the screen, then looked up at Naomi. "The man you spoke to, the lead flight attendant, he just submitted a statement. He's denying everything. Says you were argumentative and refused to cooperate with safety instructions." Naomi didn't flinch. "I have the recording." "I know," Mr. Langston said. "And we've reviewed it." Your tone was calm throughout. You never raised your voice. You cited your rights clearly, and you even offered to show your boarding pass multiple times." He paused. "But here's the thing. Even without the recording, I'd believe you. Because I know what it looks like when someone is being honest and when someone is hiding behind procedure." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the airport buzzed with morning activity. Planes taxiing, carts moving, voices echoing over the intercom. Life going on as if nothing had changed. But something had. Before she left, Mr. Langston handed her a sealed envelope. "This is a formal apology from the airline," he said. "And a full refund plus future flight credits. But more importantly, it's a commitment. We're asking you to be part of our advisory group on passenger equity, not as a token, as a voice that matters." Naomi hesitated. She wasn't looking for a role. She was a doctor, not an activist. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. "No pressure. But thank you for speaking up. You didn't have to. Most people wouldn't." She walked out of the lounge and into the main terminal. Sunlight streamed through the high windows. Travelers hurried past with coffee cups and rolling suitcases. She felt strangely light, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had finally been set down. Her phone buzzed in her bag. A message from her sister. "You land yet?" "I'm outside with coffee." Naomi smiled for the first time in hours. As she headed toward baggage claim, she passed a newsstand. On one of the digital screens above it, a headline scrolled by. "Airline investigates alleged discrimination incident on overnight flight." No names, no photos. Just facts. She kept walking. Later that day, while waiting for her ride, she saw a young woman, maybe early 20s, dark skin, tired eyes, being questioned by gate agents about her seat assignment. The agents were polite but firm, suggesting she might have misread her ticket. The woman stood her ground, voice quiet but clear. "This is my seat. I paid for it." Naomi didn't intervene. She didn't need to, because the young woman didn't look scared. She looked certain. And in that moment, Naomi realized something. Change didn't always come in grand gestures or viral videos. Sometimes it came in the quiet refusal to move, in the decision to stay seated, in the courage to say, "No, this is mine." She got into her sister's car, accepted the coffee, and leaned her head back against the seat. "I'm glad you're here," her sister said. "Pulling into traffic, me too," Naomi replied. And for the first time in a long time, she meant it, not just about the visit, but about everything. She hadn't set out to make a statement. She just wanted to go home, but sometimes going home meant standing your ground first, and that was okay. The story didn't stay quiet for long. By mid-morning, just hours after Naomi stepped off the plane, snippets began appearing online. Not from her, she hadn't posted a thing, but from passengers who'd been on the flight. One shared a short, blurry video on a community forum. A glimpse of the lead flight attendant leaning into first class, voice sharp, gesturing toward the back of the plane. Another wrote a detailed account on a travel blog, describing how the crew had ignored Naomi for the entire flight, how the tension had thickened the air like fog. A third passenger, the retired attorney, sent a formal letter to the airline's CEO and copied a local news outlet. Within 24 hours, the story had legs. News vans showed up at the airline's headquarters. Reporters called former employees. Social media buzzed with questions. Has this happened before? Who was the passenger? Why did the crew think this was okay? The airline's customer service lines lit up. Emails flooded in, not just complaints but stories, dozens of them. A teacher who'd been asked to move so a man, more accustomed to first class, could sit up front. A veteran who said he'd watched his black wife be questioned 3 times about her ticket while he stood right beside her. A college student who'd been told her upgrade must have been a mistake. Naomi watched it all unfold from her sister's living room, wrapped in a soft blanket, mug of tea in hand. She felt strange, detached almost. This was her life, her experience, but it now belonged to everyone else too. Strangers were debating her tone, her choices, whether she'd overreacted. Some praised her courage. Others accused her of making everything about race. She read a few comments, then closed the tab and didn't look back. She hadn't wanted fame. She hadn't wanted a movement. She'd just wanted to sit in the seat she'd earned. But once the truth was out, it took on a life of its own. That afternoon, the airline issued its first public statement, short, formal, apologetic. They confirmed an internal investigation was underway, expressed deep regret for the passengers' experience, and promised immediate action if wrongdoing was found. They didn't name Naomi. They didn't name the crew. But they didn't deny it either. 2 days later, they issued a second statement, longer, more specific, effective immediately. All cabin crew members involved in the incident had been terminated, not suspended, not reassigned, fired. The announcement came with a video from the CEO, a woman Naomi had never seen before, standing in front of the airline's logo, speaking directly to the camera. Her voice was steady, her eyes sincere. "What happened on Flight 287 was unacceptable," she said. "It violated our core values, our policies, and the trust our passengers place in us every day. We failed Dr. Ellis, and we failed every passenger who has ever been made to feel unwelcome because of who they are." She went on to outline new measures: mandatory anti-bias training developed with civil rights organizations, a third-party audit of customer service protocols, and the creation of a passenger equity council, chaired by independent advocates, not airline executives. Naomi watched the video once, then turned it off. She appreciated the accountability, but she knew words were easy. Actions would tell the real story. Meanwhile, the media kept calling. National outlets, morning shows, podcasts, they all wanted an interview. "Just 5 minutes," they'd say. "Your voice matters." But Naomi kept saying no. She wasn't hiding. She just didn't believe her story should be entertainment. If people wanted to understand what happened, they could read the facts. They didn't need her face on a screen to make it real. Instead, she did something quieter. She wrote a short statement, just 3 paragraphs, and sent it to the airline with permission to share it publicly. No anger, no blame. Just clarity. I didn't ask for special treatment. I asked for equal treatment. What happened on that flight wasn't about one bad crew. It was about a system that allowed bias to go unnoticed, unchallenged, and unpunished. I'm grateful the airline has taken responsibility, but real change won't come from firing a few employees. It will come from asking hard questions. Who gets the benefit of the doubt? Whose comfort is prioritized? And who gets asked to move again and again just to keep things smooth? Dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right. And it should be guaranteed to every passenger no matter what they look like or where they sit. The airline posted it on their website and social channels. Within hours it was shared thousands of times, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Back home, life tried to return to normal. Naomi flew back to her city a few days later. This time in coach, no upgrades, no fanfare. She walked through the hospital doors on a Monday morning like she always did. Stethoscope around her neck, coffee in hand, ready for rounds. Her colleagues knew what had happened, of course. News traveled fast in tight-knit departments. But no one made a big deal. They just nodded, offered quiet support, and got back to work. That was the kind of solidarity she valued most. Not applause, but presence. Still, things had shifted. A nurse pulled her aside during a break. "My cousin saw your statement," she said, eyes shining. "She's applying to flight school." She said, "If Dr. Ellis can stand up like that, maybe I can too." A janitor in the hallway gave her a small smile and said, "We saw you. We're proud." Even the hospital administrator stopped by her office, not to congratulate her, but to ask if she'd help review their own patient experience policies for hidden biases. "You've got a gift for seeing what others miss," he said. Naomi hadn't thought of herself that way. But maybe it was true. Maybe years of listening to patients, their words, their silences, their unspoken fears, had taught her how to hear the quiet injustices too. One evening, as she sat in her apartment eating takeout and flipping through medical journals, her phone rang. It was Mr. Langston again. "We're rolling out the new training next week," he said. "We'd like you to record a short message for the crew. Just a minute or two." Not as a victim. As a reminder of why this work matters, she thought about it. Then she said yes, she didn't write a script. She just sat in her kitchen, turned on her phone's camera, and spoke from the heart. "Hi. I'm a doctor. Most days I'm in a hospital trying to heal people. But a few weeks ago I was just a passenger, tired, wanting to get home, hoping for a little peace. What I experienced wasn't violent. It wasn't loud, but it was dehumanizing, because it sent a message. You don't belong here unless you're willing to make yourself smaller. You, as flight attendants, have incredible power. Not just to serve drinks or check seatbelts, but to make people feel seen. Or unseen. Please choose to see everyone, equally, fully, without assumption, because how you treat the quiet passenger in 1A might be the only kindness or cruelty they experience all day." She sent the video. They used it in the first training session. A week later, she received an email from a flight attendant. Not from her flight, but from another route. "I watched your message," it read. I cried. I didn't realize how my polite requests might sound to someone who's been asked to move their whole life. "Thank you for helping me see it." That meant more to her than any headline. Meanwhile, the ripple effects continued. 2 other major airlines quietly announced they were reviewing their own seating policies. A congressional aide reached out, asking if Naomi would support a new bill proposing federal standards for fair treatment in air travel. She agreed, but only if the focus stayed on systemic reform, not personal stories. She wasn't trying to become a spokesperson. She just didn't want anyone else to sit in that seat and feel what she'd felt. One afternoon, while walking through the hospital parking lot, she saw a young intern staring at her. The intern hesitated, then approached. "Dr. Ellis?" she asked, voice soft. "I saw what you did. On the plane." Naomi nodded. "It wasn't anything grand." "It was to me," the intern said. "I've been told to tone it down so many times, my hair, my voice, my opinions. Watching you just stay seated, it gave me courage." Naomi smiled. "Then my job's done." She kept walking, but the moment stayed with her. Because that was the real victory, not the firings, not the headlines, not even the policy changes. It was the quiet understanding passing between 2 people who'd both been told, in 1,000 small ways that they didn't quite fit. And now, they knew they did. The world hadn't changed overnight. But somewhere in 1,000 small moments it was beginning to bend, and that was enough. 3 months passed and life settled into a new kind of rhythm. The headlines faded. The news cycles moved on. Social media chatter about the incident slowed to a trickle, then disappeared altogether. To the outside world it was over. Another story that flared bright and then vanished into the endless scroll of daily life. But for Naomi, the quiet after the storm was where the real work began. She returned to her hospital schedule like nothing had changed. Early mornings, late nights, the steady hum of beeping monitors and hurried footsteps down sterile hallways. Yet something inside her had shifted. She moved through her days with a deeper awareness, not just of her patient's symptoms, but of the invisible weights they carried, the stress of being overlooked, the exhaustion of having to prove your worth again and again, the quiet toll of being treated as less than in small, everyday ways. One Tuesday morning during rounds, she paused outside a patient's room. An elderly woman, recently admitted for heart failure, was sitting by the window staring out at the city skyline. Her chart noted she'd missed several follow-up appointments. When Naomi asked why, the woman didn't mention transportation or cost. She said, "Last time I came, the front desk kept asking if I was sure I had an appointment. Like I'd snuck in, I just stopped coming." Naomi sat down beside her, not as a doctor with a clipboard, but as someone who understood. They talked for 20 minutes about dignity, about being seen, about how hard it is to keep showing up when you feel like a burden. By the end, the woman agreed to stay for treatment. Not because of medicine, but because someone had finally listened. That became Naomi's new focus. Not grand gestures, but presence. Not changing the world in one sweep, but making sure the people in front of her felt respected, heard, and believed. Back at the airline, changes were taking root too. The anti-bias training wasn't a one-time lecture. It was ongoing. Role-playing scenarios, guest speakers from civil rights groups, anonymous feedback from passengers after every flight. Crew members were encouraged to speak up if they saw something off, without fear of retaliation. And the Passenger Equity Council, Naomi had finally agreed to join, met monthly, reviewing real complaints, not just policies on paper. She never attended as a celebrity. She came as herself, quiet, observant, asking questions more than giving answers. At one meeting, a young flight attendant shared how she'd recently stopped a colleague from asking a black family to double-check their boarding passes while ignoring a white family with identical seats. "I remembered Dr. Ellis's video," she said. And I thought, no, not on my watch. Naomi didn't correct her. She just nodded. Because it wasn't about her. It never had been. Around the same time, the congressional bill she'd quietly supported moved forward. It didn't pass overnight. It faced delays, debates, compromises, but it stayed alive. And for the first time, it included language about subjective service decisions and required airlines to track and report demographic data on seating changes and passenger complaints. Not perfect, but progress. She declined to testify. Instead, she wrote a letter, short, factual, grounded in her experience, and asked that it be entered into the record. In it, she wrote, "Fair treatment shouldn't depend on who you know, what you wear, or whether you're willing to stay silent. It should be built into the system." One afternoon, while grabbing coffee between shifts, she ran into the retired attorney from the flight, Robert. He was visiting his daughter in the city and recognized her immediately. "I saw your letter," he said, stirring sugar into his cup. "You didn't need to mention me, but thank you for including my account." "I didn't mention you by name," she said. "But I made sure your words were part of the record." He smiled. "Good, because sometimes it takes more than one voice to make people listen." They chatted for a few minutes about books, the weather, the slow pace of real change. Before they parted, he said, "You know, most people would have just moved seats. Avoided the hassle, but you didn't. And because of that, things are different now." Naomi shook her head. "I didn't do it to change things. I did it because it was wrong. And that's exactly why it worked," he replied. She thought about that all the way back to the hospital. Later that week, she received a package with no return address. Inside was a framed photo, black and white, slightly grainy, of the airport terminal on the morning after the flight. In the corner, barely visible, was her figure walking toward baggage claim, tote bag over her shoulder, sunlight catching the edge of her silhouette. On the back, in neat handwriting, it read, "Thank you for staying seated." She hung it in her office behind her desk, where only she and her patients could see it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. One day, a new intern, a young woman with braids and sharp eyes, knocked on her door during a quiet moment. She'd just started her rotation and had been assigned to shadow Naomi for the week. "I know who you are," the intern said, not with awe, but with quiet respect. "My mom showed me your statement. She's a flight attendant. She said your words changed how she sees her job." Naomi looked up from her chart. "I'm just a doctor," she said gently. "That's all I've ever been." "But you stood up," the intern said. "And that mattered." Naomi thought for a moment. Then she closed the chart and gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down. Let me tell you something important." The intern did. "Standing up isn't always loud," Naomi said. "Sometimes it's just refusing to move. Sometimes it's asking a question no one else will. Sometimes it's showing up day after day and treating people like they matter, even when the system tells you they don't." She paused. "You don't need a spotlight to make a difference. You just need to care enough to see people clearly." The intern nodded, eyes bright. "I'll remember that." A few days later, Naomi saw her gently correct a nurse who'd assumed a non-English speaking patient didn't understand and was about to skip explaining a procedure. The intern stepped in, found a translator, and made sure the patient gave informed consent. No fanfare, just care. That was the legacy Naomi wanted. Not her name in the news, but a chain reaction of small acts of decency. Back home, she started saying yes to things she used to avoid. She spoke at a local high school career day, not about fame or controversy, but about listening, integrity, and the courage to do what's right when no one's watching. She joined a hospital committee focused on inclusive patient care, helping redesign intake forms so they didn't assume everyone had the same background or resources. She still flew occasionally. The airline always offered upgrades, but she usually declined. When she did accept, she noticed the difference immediately. The crew greeted her warmly, but not deferentially. They checked in like they did with everyone else. No special treatment, just consistent respect. On one flight, a young girl, maybe 8 or 9, sat across the aisle with her mother. During the drink service, the flight attendant asked the girl what she'd like. The girl, shy, whispered, "Apple juice, please." The attendant smiled, coming right up. As she walked away, the girl turned to her mother and said, "She didn't ask if I was sure. She just believed me. Naomi heard it." And she smiled to herself. Because that was the goal. Not punishment, not revenge, but a world where belief came first. One evening, as she walked home from the hospital, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Mr. Langston. The airline's passenger complaint data had dropped by 40% in categories related to unfair treatment and discriminatory service, not because people stopped experiencing bias, but because they finally felt safe reporting it, and the system was responding. He ended the message with, "You started something that's still growing." Naomi didn't reply right away. She just looked up at the sky, same sky she'd flown through that night, now dotted with stars again. She thought about how small one person seemed beneath it, and yet, how much one choice could echo. She typed back, "Just keep listening." Then she put her phone away and kept walking. The next morning, she arrived at the hospital before sunrise. Room 312 needed a check-in. Mr. Thompson, recovering from valve surgery, grumpy but soft-hearted, always asking about her day. She knocked, stepped inside, and greeted him by name. "How's the coffee today?" he asked, squinting at her. "Terrible," she said with a smile. "But the company's good," he chuckled. "Stick around, Doc. You make this place feel like home." And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of healing, Naomi knew she was exactly where she belonged, not as a symbol, not as a story, but as herself, doing what was right, one patient, one choice, one day at a time.